Hi guys, it's Mr. Stevens here. We are back reading Son of the Morning Star, Custer and the Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. We're going to pick up right where we left off in the last video, and away we go. A nephew, Charles Edwin Reynolds, wrote to historian Brinnenstuhl in 1925 that the first news they had of Custer battle came from Chicago newspapers. Quote, I have never forgotten, although then a small boy, the look of agony on a father's face as his eye ran down the casualty list and he reached the name of Charlie Reynolds. Lieutenant Donald McIntosh died not far from Charlie. Private Theodore Golden saw a mob of about 60 Indians attacking McIntosh. Quote, I noticed that his lariat was dragging on the ground, once in a while catching in the tall grass or sagebrush and then breaking loose, and the picket pin bounding high in the air. The Bismarck Tribune wrote, quote, McIntosh, though a half-breed, was a gentleman of culture and esteemed by all who knew him. He leaves a family at Lincoln. Thus far, the Trib may be right. His father was Canadian, his mother probably an Indian of the Six Nations. That Tosh, as the soldiers called him, was a gentleman of culture may be accepted on faith. Photographs are deceptive, but this angular male with an invisible smile and a long nose does not look like an oaf or a lout. That he was esteemed by all who knew him is an expression of courtesy we extend, unless there is massive contradictory evidence. That he left a family at Lincoln might be argued. The Army and Navy Journal, which handled money from a relief fund established for the benefit of widows and children, allocated $510 to Mrs. Donald McIntosh, but no children are listed. The Trib becomes less reliable when describing his death, which is presented as though a reporter witnessed it. Quote, he was pulled from his horse, tortured, and finally murdered at the pleasure of the Red Devils. The Trib also has McIntosh armed with a saber, which is untrue. As for being pulled from his horse, this is possible, although by no means certain. Indians interviewed years after the battle mentioned one of their littler chiefs who tried to remount his horse and stuck his boot all the way through the stirrup. The animal bolted, dragging this officer. This might possibly have been McIntosh, but there is no evidence that the Sioux caught him alive, tortured, and disposed of him at their pleasure. In the grass beside a severely mutilated corpse whose features had been pounded into a gelatinous glob, a sergeant major from Gibbon's command noticed an unusual gutta percha button. Lieutenant Francis Gibson of H Company was able to identify it. He remembered that his sister gave him some of these buttons to her husband just before the regiment left Fort Lincoln. Her husband was Tosh McIntosh. Not much remained of McIntosh when the slain officers were disinterred and shipped east for reburial in 1877. Ex-Private Roman Rutten wrote to ex-Sergeant John Ryan long afterward that he had talked with the man who prepared McIntosh for shipment to Arlington. There were only a few bones in a cast-iron box, the skull smashed by a tomahawk. Quote, I suppose you have one of Anheuser-Busch pictures of the fight, Rutten continued, alluding to the horrifying Anheuser-Busch lithograph which still hangs in thousands of saloons from one corner of America to another. I have a grand one. Captain Benteen wrote to Mrs. Benteen, quote, I am inclined to think that had McIntosh divested himself of that slow-poking way which was his peculiar characteristic, he might have been left in the land of the living. He must have been homelier than one might suspect from his photograph, because it was said that when Lieutenant George Wallace, who was not very handsome, reported for duty at Fort Rice, he went immediately to pay his respects to the senior lieutenant, McIntosh. It was evening when Wallace arrived, so he went to the McIntosh home. Mrs. McIntosh opened the door. My God, she exclaimed, throwing up her hands, you are the first man I ever saw that is uglier than my husband. Reno's adjutant, Benjamin Hubert Benny Hodgson, was one of several doomed men who predicted the future. Before the fight, he remarked that if he was wounded or dismounted, he intended to grab someone's stirrup and be dragged to safety. So it happened. While Reno's disorganized unit was trying to get across the river, a bullet went through Hodgson's leg and killed his horse. He called for help. Somebody came splashing by. He clutched a stirrup and was towed across. but his presence dissolved before the end, or else he could not believe what he foresaw. On the opposite bank, temporarily safe, he was struck by another bullet and killed. It is not clear whose stirrup he grabbed. At least 4 troopers from Reno's battalion claimed his honor, nor is it clear who served him last. Private Thomas Coleman of McDougall's B Company kept a most extraordinary journal. Coleman reports on the 27th, quote, "This morning after sunrise I went over the battlefield on this side of the river, and the first person I saw was Lieutenant B. H. Hodgson. Of my company he was shot twice with ball and once with arrow. Several other bodies lay close by. I buried the lieutenant on a nice knoll overlooking the river with the cedar tree at his head. He was a brave officer and true gentleman." Captain McDougall subsequently declared under oath that he himself, assisted by Privates Ryan and Moon, buried Hodgson on the night of the 26th after sewing him up in blankets and a poncho. Most historians trust McDougall, whereas Coleman is thought to be imaginative or at times confused, although his journal never lacks flavor. During Reno's famous retreat from the valley, a number of men found their path of escape blocked, so they hid among the cottonwoods and thick brush near the river. Lieutenant Charles DeRudio and was one of these. His account, which appeared in the New York Herald, is regarded with bleak suspicion. Walter Camp, for instance, quote, "There is a story written in the first person under the name of Lieutenant DeRudio, but it was written by Major Brisbane, of the 2nd Cavalry. DeRudio told me this himself, and cautioned me not to take all of it seriously, saying that Brisbane colored it a good deal." DeRudio's cautionary advice seems justified because there is no doubt that Major Brisbane exhibited a talent for creative writing, or as may be seen from the optimism of his magnum opus, The Beef Bonanza, or How to Get Rich on the Plains. Here we learn that a $100,000 investment would easily double within 5 years, besides paying a handsome annual dividend. Or let us say the investor prefers sheep to cattle. Quote, "The time will come when will have both shepherds and shepherdesses on the plains, when the patriarch, as of old, with his sons, daughters, and sons' wives and daughters, will follow the herds crook in hand. Any large family can become rich by following the herds. Dairy farming, too, will flourish." Quote, "In the West, the mild air and thousands of pure gushing streams furnish multitudes of natural butter and cheese ranches. The melting snows not only keep the waters cool, but the snow, air, and cool nights make the milk houses a paradise." We hear Major Brisbane's voice again in the so-called DeRudio narrative. The narrator, concealed in a ravine, listens to, quote, "the silvery but to me diabolical voices of several squaws, who are scalping an unfortunate soldier." Quote, "2 of the ladies were cutting away while the 2 others performed a sort of war dance." This must be the major at work. Truth, no matter how startling, customarily rings with a distinctive note, rather like the high, hard ring of a silver coin dropped on a table, but this clinks like a pot metal counterfeit. Brisbane was known among the troops as Grasshopper Jim because he often talked about the agricultural possibilities of Montana. One might suppose he would be nicknamed Alfalfa Jim or Winter Wheat Jim, but he probably talked a good deal about the grasshoppers which encrusted these northern plains and frequently annihilated crops. They were described as exceedingly rapacious by the chief engineer of the Department of Dakota, Captain William Ludlow, who said they would arrive in giant clusters and looked like a fall of snowflakes while descending through the last rays of the sun. Being an engineer, Ludlow undertook to calculate their numbers. One day, when the insects were not especially thick, he counted how many there were on a 12-inch by 12-inch plot of earth and found 25, which meant at least 1,000,000 an acre. The famous Scout Luther North en route to Nebraska in 1874 saw the land devastated, trees stripped, fields empty. People in the town of Columbus had tried to save their gardens by covering them with blankets and sheets, but the voracious creatures devoured the cloth before eating the vegetables and flowers, and eating the paint off the houses. Anyway, a band of Sioux approached the place where DeRudio, Brisbane, and Private Thomas O'Neill had hidden themselves. Both troopers fired. The private's eye was true, and his carbon trusty, for Mr. Indian dropped his rein, threw up his paws, and laid down on the grass to sleep his long sleep. The gentleman I greeted rode a short distance, and then did likewise. According to the Trib, DeRudio finally escaped because some beavers dove into Little Bighorn. DeRudio followed them, got out of sight, and after hiding 12 hours or more... Beavers. Why would he follow beavers? The Trib does not elaborate. Well, after creeping from bush to bush for nearly 2 days, the droll narrator and Private O'Neill managed to wade the river and scale the heights to join what remained of Reno's decimated battalion. Captain Benteen later commented that DeRudio had a romantic, thrilling story made up by the time he reached safety. So it appears that Grasshopper Jim embroidered what was already a fancy tale. As for Private O'Neill, he, quote, he is a cool, level-headed fellow and tells it plainly and the same way all the time, which is a big thing towards convincing one of the truth. Deadeye Dick O'Neill's report of this encounter does sound less fabricated. In addition to problems with enraged Sioux, he found himself troubled by a nosebleed. A nosebleed! Here we have an unhorsed cavalryman tucked into a patch of dusty underbrush. At any instant he might be seen, in which event he will quickly resemble a porcupine, yet he is concerned about a bloody nose. At the start of this fight, he tells us, he tripped, fell, and bumped his nose. Quote, not being able to give it attention at the time, the blood had trickled down his throat and almost choked him. It must be true. Nobody who was trying to fake a story would pause to insert this ridiculous diversion. And we will stop there for the day. Son of the Morning Star, Custom Little Bighorn by Evan S. Connell. Hope you guys are still enjoying it, and we'll be back with the next video soon. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.